Hey all, Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. I recently had a request from a subscriber to this channel for a story about a soldier who fought at the Battle of Stones River in Tennessee. And I thought of the perfect officer to talk about. He's pictured here. His name is Richard Waterman. And to tell you his story, let me take you to the battlefield at a critical moment. And a soldier who happened to be peering through the drifts of gun smoke during the maelstrom of fighting. And this soldier, this Union soldier, is looking through the gun smoke and he sees a gray bearded, balding man, an officer, set aside his sword and pick up cartridges and a musket from a fallen soldier and starts blasting away at the Confederates. The event, the observation of that event, was later shared in an official report, and the act of bravery was commended and commented on by many. The captain, that gray bearded man, was Waterman, 54 years old, and he's out in the middle of the battlefield setting aside his sword to fire a musket. He's the father, old enough to be the father of many in his command. He had a reputation as a kind-hearted disciplinarian, but he also drove his company of young men with a characteristic determination to hold any part of any battlefield at all costs. And that's what happened at Stones River on December 31st, 1862. Early that morning, Waterman and the rest of his regiment, the 31st Indiana, stirred from a restless night. They were bivouacking on the cold Tennessee ground in the vicinity of a cedar wood that was known to locals as Round Forest. While they were working out the kinks and soreness, getting up early in the morning, their brigade commander, Charles Cruft, Cruft was commanding the 31st and three other regiments in that brigade. They received orders to advance. Brigadier General Cruft arranged his force in two lines. He put the 31st in the main line with the 2nd Kentucky Infantry on its left, and then behind the 1st Kentucky and the 90th Ohio Infantries. The brigade, according to one report, had a front of about 600 men. At least that's Cruft's estimate. Cruft put skirmishers out ahead of the main line, and there were more Union brigades on the left and the right, so they had support. Cruft advanced the skirmishers at a run into the field in front of them, and they soon engaged with enemy skirmishers. Behind these Confederate skirmishers was a full brigade of battle-hardened Mississippians under the command of James R. Chalmers, a brigadier who had performed quite well at Shiloh earlier in the year. The Confederate skirmishers drove the Federal skirmishers back across the field just as Cruft was moving his front line, including Waterman and the 31st and the 2nd Kentucky, to the edge of the cedar woods. The Federals didn't have much time because the Confederate skirmishers and behind them the brigade was coming in. They had little time to prepare for the attack by Chalmers' Mississippians. According to the historian of the 31st, the Indianians, laid down their guns and went to work. And in a few minutes, you would have thought, this is the historian speaking, you would have thought that every man was a natural born stonecutter and that each one was a master builder. They quickly constructed a rail fence in the front, and by the time the skirmishers had moved in, the position, according to the regimental historian, was next to impregnable. Now here's Waterman In the middle of this, he's armed with a sword and a pair of revolvers. He steadies his men and his company for the Confederate onslaught. Cruft remembers the enemy pushed toward us rapidly and charged my line in great force and in solid rank. His charge was made in two lines with the appearance of a four-rank formation and in admirable order and discipline. Watermen, the Indianans, the Kentuckians returned fire with deadly accuracy and inflicted heavy casualties, including Chalmers himself. He was wounded. The Mississippians recoiled, withdrew a short distance, and reformed. Crust continued his report. Quote, after the first repulse and before my line could be advanced, the enemy made a second charge, reserving fire until a close approach was had, which was more furious than before. What actually happened? The Mississippians sent repeated volleys that ripped into the ranks of the Indiana and Kentucky boys, who responded with their own well-aimed musket fire. The fighting escalated to fever pitch. The Indianans exhausted almost all of their ammunition. The living, including Waterman, spent precious seconds scrambling among the dead and the wounded as the drifts of battle smoke were covering this sector of the battlefield. They were rummaging through the cartridge boxes and anything that they could find, the equipment they could find, picking up the muskets, loading the muskets as quickly as they could to stop the onslaught, to beat back these Confederates. It's probably during these tense moments that Waterman likely set aside his sword and grabbed a musket and joined in the melee. A half an hour of this ferocious fighting kept up as the Indianans were using up any ammunition they could find. Chalmers' crippled brigade finally retreated in confusion. That area before the 31st became known as the Mississippi Half Acre, in grim recognition of the large number of dead soldiers from Chalmers' brigade that blanketed the battlefield. Cruft, noticing that he had a brief lull in the action, sent forward one of the regiments in the rear of his line, the 1st Kentucky. These men advanced into an open field where they were hit hard by enemy infantry and artillery fire. They fell back with considerable loss. By now, another Confederate brigade had moved up to replace Chalmers' badly cut up Mississippians. This new brigade was composed by Tennessee regiments led by Brigadier General Daniel S. Donaldson. Donaldson promptly advanced against Cruft, Waterman, and the rest of the 31st. They did their best to hit the Tennesseans with everything they had and initially drove them back. But Donaldson's troops were not finished. They changed their point of attack and launched a new assault that flanked the Federals. The 31st was now falling back in confusion into the dense woods, and they scattered as the fighting continued unabated. One man later recalled, quote, the rattle of battle being so terrific that it was difficult to make yourself heard. They're in serious trouble, these Union men. But the gains by Donaldson's brigade were temporary. Other Union forces jumped into the fray and ultimately repulsed the Confederates. However, Waterman and some of his men were not so fortunate to escape. They were surrounded in the cedar thickets. And there came a moment when Waterman knew that his capture was certainty, and he pulled off his shoulder straps. You can see them on his uniform. He pulled off his shoulder straps and hid his sword and his sidearms, pretending to be a hospital steward when he fell into enemy hands and was questioned by his captors. According to an article commenting on Waterman's actions, nowadays you might think that that was a sign of cowardice, but in fact, it was considered to be clever and not a reflection on his bravery. It was always considered a sharp move by his fellow officers because there were rumors that the rebel authorities were at that time giving Union officers harsh treatment. Now, Waterman, just by coincidence, was well qualified to be a hospital steward. 3 decades earlier, he had graduated from Jefferson Medical College in Philadelphia. After graduation, some might have expected him to return to his native Rhode Island, where he's from, to practice medicine, but he was inspired to go abroad, and instead he went west and settled in a place called Vicksburg, Mississippi. This was in the 1830s. However, while he was there, according to one commentator, quote, slavery turned him bitterly against that section. This is an Indiana county historian quoting, saying that he was not happy with slavery and relocated to the Hoosier state to be able to find a better place to live and a better place to practice medicine. He ultimately became a physician in Vermilion County, married, started a family, and became an influential resident in the township of Eugene. In 1857, just a few years before the war, he moved to the adjacent Fountain County and prospered as a businessman, leaving medicine behind. And he was a businessman dealing in grain, pork, and dry goods. Now, Waterman's passions were stirred when the war came. According to that Indiana county historian, quote, Southern secession caused his anti-slavery principles to assert themselves. The same historian said that Waterman had told him that the war would end when the Negroes were freed. That's a quote from the same county history. So in the summer of 1861, that first summer of the war, Waterman raised men for a local company, the Wabash Rifles, or Wabash Rifles. One of the recruits was one of his sons, Roberts. The rank and file voted for officers, which is a common practice among volunteers, and elected Waterman second lieutenants. Interestingly, he had not exactly intended to serve, but he couldn't resist the offer, and so he received a commission, got a uniform, and took command of the company. The Rifles became Company A of the 31st Indiana. The regiment's original colonel was Charles Cruft, who went on to become the brigade commander. In the fall of 61, the 31st moved to Tennessee, and in February 1862, participated in the Union victory at Fort Donaldson, and then 2 months later at Shiloh. The 31st was in it again, suffering 142 casualties in hard fighting. By this time, Waterman had advanced to captain and commander of the company. Cruft, by that time, had also left the regiment with his brigadier star. Now, flash forward to the end of 1862, the Battle of Stones River. The 31st suffered 87 casualties entirely. Waterman and 36 others were among those captured and prisoners of war. The Confederates ultimately believed Waterman's claim to be hospital steward, and they grouped him together with the enlisted men, separating him from the officers. Any hopes that Waterman had for better treatment as a private were not realized. He said, I was carried all over Southern country and finally landed in the prisons of Richmond, naked and half-starved. That's a quote from Waterman. That journey lasted 3 weeks through the cold winter weather. He arrived in Richmond, Virginia, January 21st, 1863. His health was deteriorating rapidly, and the Confederate authorities released him only 5 days after he arrived in Richmond. They sent him across federal lines to Camp Parole in Maryland to be formally exchanged. The doctors took one look at him and immediately put him in the hospital. He remained at Camp Parole in the hospital there for 4 months until he was well enough to be able to rejoin the regiment. By that time, they were in Tennessee, only about 8 miles from Stones River. According to a fellow officer, Waterman returned to the scene of his capture once or twice, searching for that sword and revolvers that he had concealed and left behind. In fact, according to his statement, the sword and the revolvers, he tucked them beneath a log in the cedar thickets, but he couldn't find them. In September 1863, about 9 months after Stone's River, at the Battle of Chickamauga, Waterman was in it again, and this time he suffered a serious and debilitating gunshot wound in his hip. The injury ended his combat effectiveness and further compromised his already precarious health. Cruft, the trusted brigadier general, who happened to be a fan of Waterman, became aware of his situation, his health situation, and appointed Waterman to his staff as an aide and assigned him to light duties, including stints as a recruiter and a military railroad conductor. But it wasn't enough. Despite Cruft's best efforts to keep Waterman away from the rigors of campaign, Waterman's health continued to decline. He was forced to resign, and Waterman did so, returned to Indiana, and arrived on August 17th, 1864. He reportedly told his family, quote, "I've come home to die," unquote. And Waterman made good on his word. He died 6 days after he arrived home, just a few months shy of his 56th birthday. The Indiana county historian paid tribute to Waterman with this quote: "Out of the pain and death of him and thousands of other braves came the perpetuity of a great government," end quote. That's the end of Waterman's life, the end of his story, and the legacy of what he left behind. Oh, one more bit that you want to know about. 17 years later, in the autumn of 1881, a druggist named Carter E. Wright, who was a war veteran, he had served in the 105th Illinois Infantry, happened to be touring the battlefield of Stone's River. And as he was poking around some bushes, he found a sword. The sword was inscribed R. M. Waterman, 31st Regiment, IVM. Richard Mason Waterman, 31st Regiment, Indiana Volunteer Militia. It was hidden. He picked it up, probably had that thrill go through him. For those of you who have ever found a relic, you know what I mean. Found it beneath the bushes and set about trying to find the family. He eventually found Waterman's son Robert, who had served in the war with his dad and survived, and returned that sword to him. So there you have the entire story of Richard Waterman, his fighting at the Battle of Stone's River, his capture and imprisonment, his brief imprisonment in Richmond, his wounding at Chickamauga, and his death not too long before his 56th birthday. Thanks for listening. We'll see you on the next episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail.